Good evening. I'm Mike Perry. I'm the Executive Director of the Army Heritage Center Foundation. And tonight we're pleased to have Professor Alexander Nemerov as our speaker. Professor Nemerov is the Carl and Marilyn Thoma Professorial Professor in the Arts and Humanities, as well as the Chair of the Department of Art and Art History at Stanford University. He was previously a Professor of Art History and American Studies at Yale University. Professor Nemerov writes about the presence of art in the recollection of the past and the importance of humanities in our lives today. He is committed to teaching the history of art more broadly, as well as topics in American visual culture. Over the years, he has published many books and articles pertaining to American art from the 18th century to the 1970s. His writings often analyze fiction and poetry alongside works of visual art. Tonight, he's here to talk about something a little bit different. He's going to talk about a more historical topic, the Port of Chicago explosion that occurred in July 1944. I'd ask you to hold your questions to the end. Professor Nemerov, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike. I'll just share my screen now. Okay, everybody, thank you. Thank you, Mike, for that introduction. Thank you all for joining me today, this evening for you. I would like to talk, as Mike said, about I think a very momentous event, catastrophe in the Second World War on the home front that is perhaps somewhat well known, but is also probably undeservedly obscure to this day, and it is the giant explosion at the munitions loading facility at Port Chicago. Don't be confused by the Chicago there. We're talking about a place in California, specifically in the San Francisco Bay Area, Port Chicago, that took place on the evening of July 17, 1944. The biggest explosion ever in the Bay Area. You're looking at a declassified photograph, declassified in the 1970s, showing the aftermath. You see that pier extending out into the distance. That is part of the pier along which two Liberty ships exploded, one in particular, and led to the loss of life of some 300 plus sailors and civilians, most of whom, 2/3 of whom were Black. And so this is a question about racism, about segregation in the Second World War military for us to consider today. So at Port Chicago, which began its munitions loading era in 1942, it was the lot of many Black servicemen to handle high explosives of all different kinds, ranging from small rounds on up to different kinds of artillery shells, torpedoes, incendiary devices, etc. You're seeing some photographs of the place. Railway cars came right up to near to the dock you saw before, and on these spurs and sidings, stocked with some of the munitions that would then go over to the adjacent Liberty ships for loading and eventual transport to the Pacific Theater. You can see in this photograph, which shows a little bit of the loading process, that, you know, there are white sailors there. You can see on the ship there's both a Black and a white sailor, but this is largely a hazardous duty performed by Black men under the supervision of white officers, in keeping with the segregated military at that time. This is an overview of Port Chicago, and it takes a moment to kind of adjust your eyes here, but if you see at the sort of center left of the photograph, you know, there is a dock or a pier that extends upward, and that is the Port Chicago pier. If you look just to the right of it, land side, you see these curious little slits in the land, and those are berms or bunkers in which some of the railway cars we've seen before would be shielded and housed, you know, and the very existence of those berms speaks to the dangers of the high explosives. In other words, those mounds of earth are there to shield some of these railway cars from damage should there be an explosion. Just so that in the very upper right of the photograph, you see the gridded streets of a town, and that is the town of Port Chicago, about a mile from the pier. And there's a railway line, I think you can see, traveling through or intervening between the town and the pier. Just to continue to orient ourselves here, and to again fix in our minds that this is an event of the San Francisco Bay Area. If you look the bottom left of this overhead, you see the Golden Gate with the Golden Gate Bridge. If you follow all the way through the famous San Francisco Bay out to San Pablo Bay, and then even further to the right to Suisun Bay, through the Carquinez Strait, that's where Port Chicago was and is. It's actually an active military base to this day. And that is the location that we're talking about. Now, on the night of July 17th, 1944, there were not one but two ships called Liberty ships, which, and you see one here, like a modern restored Liberty ship, that were there to be stocked, you know, from the bottom of the hold on up with the different kinds of munitions, not to mention fuel, that I've described. And on the night in question, there were two such ships. One, which had arrived 4 days earlier, is on the bottom of this diagram. The SSEA Bryan arrived on July 13th, and by the evening of July 17th was about 40% full of high explosives. The Keynote had just arrived not long before and was largely empty except for fuel. Both are headed to the Pacific, and you can see the middle part of the diagram, which indicates you know, the pier itself, suggests some of the different loading operations. So at 10:18 p.m. on the night of July 17th, there was, according to reports, the sound of a falling heavy object. Perhaps it was a bomb that had been dropped by one of the winches that were heavily used to load weaponry onto these ships. There was a sound of rending, tearing wood, apparently, as though the bomb had fallen through or crushed some of the wooden pier. And then about 5 to 7 seconds later, according to reports, there was a massive explosion. And to get a sense of the scale of the explosion, you can use this photograph taken shortly afterwards, a few days afterwards, as an index. And partly what I want you to see here are the objects in the water at a distance at the right center, and those are two parts of the Kino, the second of those Liberty ships. And when I have been there with Navy men, one retired, one active, actually father and son, it is the fact that this Liberty ship, albeit mostly empty, was blown 500 feet away by the explosion. It is that fact that it most awes these two Navy guys about the sheer force of this explosion. The sound boom, so they say, was heard from like Petaluma in the North Bay all the way down to Redwood City in the South Bay. I live in Palo Alto. I sometimes when I walk on the Stanford campus, I can feel that the stones of the buildings there bear in their bones the sonic boom of that night. In any case, a pilot flying overhead reported, at 12,000 feet, being startled to see basically a locomotive-size chunk of metal rising up through the air and past his airplane. And another pilot observing estimated that the fireball of this explosion was like 3 miles in size. So 300 men plus died instantly. Almost 400 were injured. There is the Kino in a closer view, which, kind of doesn't look like anything this photograph necessarily except evidence. But, again, we know the sort of fearsome power of the blast that it signifies. Blackouts and news restrictions being what they were, nonetheless, it was something that could not help but be reported, and sort of fascinating to think about this in terms of World War II history more generally, because it would be only 3 days later that there would be another and actually far more well-known blast, this one happening in Europe. That would be the assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler conducted by Klaus von Stauffenberg and other conspirators. So that was on July 20th, 1944. This is on July 17th. When the survivors, if that's the word, because the survivors, really no one survived who was there, but the survivors in the sense that of men who had furloughs or leaves that night, who were elsewhere, maybe in Oakland, not far away, when they were ordered back to work some 3 weeks later, and when they refused to go, citing the unsafe conditions, and it is true that the white officers were documented as holding races to see which one of their all-black teams could load the most tonnage in the shortest amount of time, etc. Safety regulations also being lacking. When they were ordered to go back to work, they refused. They were arrested, charged with mutiny, and all 50 of those charged, despite the presence of future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, shown here on the right, who went out, especially from Washington, not to try the case on their behalf, but as I recall, to advise. All 50 were convicted and all sentenced to very serious prison terms of, I believe, 15 years of hard labor. So Fred Meeks there, for example, is one of the ones who was sentenced. And although these sentences were commuted, shortened shortly after the war ended in almost every case, I think 47 out of 50, the injustice of the charge of mutiny kind of belied the whole notion of democracy, a notion that Black citizens had always espoused in the so-called double V campaigning for victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism and its own version of fascism at home. What happened to the mutineers, so-called, really belied the notion of democracy at home. Despite their release, they were not exonerated of the charge of disloyalty until very recently, 2019, in fact. And when you look at the V's in the double victory sign there, it's hard for me, and as Mike mentioned, I'm an art historian, so I look at images as a living. It's hard for me not to look at the, in one sense, kind of merely descriptive documentary photographs taken of the Port Chicago environs after the explosion, and it's, you know, and see them as actually indicating a lot more than just mere documents. So when I look at this photograph, which for example appears to be of perhaps like an officers club or some common army building, Commons Army building, I don't see V's, but I see a lot of X's or broken V's in the timber that is fallen from the roof. I see, you know, a kind of inadvertent but powerful image of cancellation, of defeat, of you know, injustice, destruction, etc. Not V's, but X's or broken V's. When I look at this photograph, which is of the Port Chicago train station, so you'll recall, you see those railway lines, and you recall that overhead photograph that basically plotted out the position of the railway to the town. When I look at this photograph, which is always the most moving of these for me, it's very hard not to see it as more also than mere document, though certainly it is a document of the force of the blast and the way it blew out all the windows of this structure 1 mile away from ground zero. To see it as, I don't know, a portrayal of, I always tell my students, of the haunted house of American racism. You know, the way it sort of goes on and on and on, and there are these men in the lower left who are no doubt different, you know, functionaries, different people responsible for making sense of or reporting on the disaster, measuring it, discerning what happened, etc., who also seem at the same time to be kind of powerless, to be kind of bystanders, to be helpless in the face of the dominant thing in the picture, which is just the, you know, the sheer destruction and the kind of, I know, haunted emptiness of this home-like building. You know, that the officials are there, but finally they cannot remedy what this broken depot represents, which is a tale of racial injustice. There's another angle to this which bears on a different structure, a different work of architecture, which may seem to be very different, but actually is intimately related to Port Chicago. So 5 miles away from Port Chicago is the home of really the most famous environmentalist in United States history, John Muir. And you can see it here in this overhead 19th or early 20th century photograph of its location in Martinez, California. And there on the right, you see Muir, the man on the right, posing at Yosemite with President Theodore Roosevelt on his visit to California in 1903. So the proximity of Muir's home to Port Chicago is borne out in this way, actually, if you want to go to Port Chicago, which is to say, you can't actually drive to Port Chicago because, as I mentioned, it's an active military base. So what you do, since Port Chicago is also a national park, is you park at the John Muir House. So when those sort of rolling hills in the foreground is now a parking lot, and you park there and you meet the park ranger, who will then escort you, drive you into the Port Chicago area. And this proximity is interesting because as you look at this photograph of John Muir's house in Martinez, you know, if you imagine yourself going up those steps and then up the second set of steps and up to that front door, go in, and then above the door, a little bit hard to see here, but there is a transom window. And if you go in and look at that transom window from the inside, as I was doing, as I dutifully awaited my Port Chicago tour in January of 2019, I noticed there's a crack in the transom window. I don't know if you can see it, but if you look at the floral design, the plant in its vase that the glass worker has made here, if you just look to the left of the vase, there is this vertical crack in the horizontal window. And I actually have a detail of it here. And when I was there, I noticed the crack and I asked the docent, and without missing a beat, he said what you might think I'm about to say, he said, which is that, oh yes, that was from Port Chicago. And I just thought that was an amazing moment for me as a historian of American culture, because, you know, here are the two things together in one image, like the promise of bliss, the promise of peace, the promise of beauty, even of a kind of elegance. And yet it's transected by this wound, you know, which is a historical wound, and which I cannot praise the John Muir people enough for leaving intact, for never fixing, since as a kind of living scar of one moment in time, namely those minutes right after 10 o'clock on July 17th, 1944, this crack gives me goosebumps. And in terms of, you know, electric moments that shape and define who we are, it's not unreasonable to think of the cracked transom window at John Muir's house, homely though it may seem, in connection to or contrast to Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling, with God sparking Adam's hand into life. Nonetheless, to me, the Muir house in that moment becomes a kind of Sistine chapel, except a chapel to do with this conjoining of American promise and American punishment. And so you could play with some of the other contrasts, you know, that between the long since destroyed, demolished Port Chicago train station and John Muir's house, like different versions of that same mix of promise and punishment. There's another structure in the Port Chicago documentary photographs that really intrigues me, and I'll say why, just like this. It's the movie theater. And imagine you're in the movies, and, you know, during wartime, they were showing movies 24 hours a day to accommodate the round-the-clock factory workers, home front workers. So imagine you're in there and you're taking in a show, and, you know, well, you can see what happened. I mean, the theater was not destroyed, but the blast, the sonic boom of the explosion crushed or crumpled the side wall here, like in what you see, and the roof. So I'm assuming the show was suspended, but what show, what movie? And maybe this is a kind of question that only, you know, an art historian or a visual culture person would really want to ask, but I really, really wanted to know what movie was playing at the Port Chicago Theater on the night of the explosion. And you can see this photograph's a little frustrating because it doesn't quite show you the marquee, if there is even a marquee there on the front. The photographer's more concerned to show the damaged side. Well, after much sleuthing, I was able to find a photograph of, or I'm sorry, borrowing little small newspapers on microfilm from local historical societies, finally found just in one sentence, in one article in some tiny newspaper, some reporter just happened to say, oh, well, it was the movie China. Now, Now, saying that, I'm not saying that as like we should all be saying, oh, well, China, of course, that movie we know well. Well, I had never seen this. I'm not sure how many of you have ever seen it, but I became very interested in it, right? Because, well, it's just a coincidence and it sort of plays out. So Alan Ladd is an American working in China. He's kind of jaded, in it for himself, just trying to make money. But he's there with his buddy, William Bendix. There's a love interest, Loretta Young. Eventually he's won over to the side of the Chinese after seeing their cities destroyed, their people killed, etc. And this is a propaganda film having to do with anti-Japanese sentiment, and of course the idea that the Chinese therefore are the friends of the Americans in the war. Now, I got myself a DVD copy of China and sat down to watch it, and I was very struck by, and I'm sure you would be too if you saw it, by the opening scenes, which, you know, set the tone, giving the American audience, presumably that night at Port Chicago, no less than on any other, with, you know, the right framework to understand what the message was. But as it opens, it's one explosion after another. William Bendix is making his way through this Chinese city. There's a Japanese air raid. It's a very long and complex tracking shot, actually, that follows him probably for a minute, I would say. Very choreographed as he moves through a progressive range of these explosions on the smoke-filled screen. One after another, sort of timed to detonate with his progress through this elaborate tracking shot. And finally, he comes upon a Chinese boy separated from his parents, and, you know, in a sort of symbol of American, you know, sentiment and goodwill, holds the boy in his arms and takes him to safety. Now, I don't know what time China started that night, but I'm going to let's just say that it started at 9:35, okay? It raises the question of what scene was playing at 10:18. Now here I'm completely conjecturing, but again, it's interesting, right? Because history is the history of accidents as much as it is the history of purposeful things. It wasn't when Alan Ladd, somewhat drunk at the beginning of the film, is hardly interested in the near miss escape of his buddy William Bendix. The scene, if we think it starts at 9:35, the scene that seems to correspond to 10:18 in the movie for a Port Chicago audience is actually a scene of rape, where again, in the propagandistic frame of the film, a Japanese soldier, several of them in fact, but there's a racist close-up on the left to show how evil he is, sets eyes upon a helpless Chinese family, including the boy we saw earlier in the earlier image with William Bendix. And, you know, historians, poets might put the two things together, you know, in some unknowable way. Two kinds of disaster, two kinds of violence, what was happening on the movie screen, and then what we saw, or what actually brought the movie to a complete stop. The men at Port Chicago, walking across that pier, down that pier there, you know, were one kind of black servicemen during the war. I want to just briefly contrast them to another kind of black serviceman during the war who came closer to the double V. And I want to do so, though, finally, to connect the fates of these aspirants to a better American life. So the other Black servicemen who were actually, you know, experiencing a greater sense of democracy were the, you know, still segregated, but nonetheless, like, incredibly powerful Tuskegee Airmen, photographed memorably by American photographer, a woman, Toni Frisell, in early 1945 at their base in Ramatelli, Italy. So airmen trained in Alabama around Tuskegee University into all Black squadrons, and then sent to Europe, where they proved to be extremely efficient as fighter escorts for B-17s flying deep into Germany, into Berlin itself, to Vienna, to other targets. And although there's a racist story behind Frisell's photographs, in the sense that originally a Black photographer, Gordon Parks, was supposed to make these pictures, but was prevented from doing so. Nonetheless, she did a good job at portraying not just the airmen, but the mechanics, such as the ones we're seeing in the previous picture and this one. We're looking at those airplanes. Some of you will certainly know that those are P-51 Mustangs, and those bear directly on the story of democracy and possibility and liberty that these Black men got to experience to a far greater degree than those at Fort Chicago. And the reason I say that is because the P-51, and again, some of you will know this, was the deluxe, top-of-the-line, state-of-the-art fighter aircraft for the American Air Force during the war. Is the Rolls-Royce. And the power of these things, I think you can get a sense with the four-bladed propeller, the big, thick snout housing that powerful engine. You know, we're talking about a top speed of 450 miles an hour, and also a maneuverability that's kind of off the charts in terms of, I don't know, the phrase stopping on a dime comes to mind, you know, and you had to be careful in these that you didn't black out or gray out, because the turns are so tight that you would pull the G's and certainly gray out, definitely. Now, you know, how did these men become the aviators that they were, who got to fly these airplanes? Well, you know, after the Tuskegee Airmen were established in 1940-41, they're training, like many other airmen, on the kind of plane you see at the upper right, a Stearman trainer with 220 horsepower. You know, kind of a good plane to train on, because, you know, it can take a lot of damage, it's not going anywhere fast, etc. They then moved, you know, in a wartime sense, to planes like the P-40 Warhawk there on the right, not 220 horsepower, but 1,360 horsepower. And that was like a shock for these airmen, as it would have been for anyone, right? That, you know, they were accustomed to kind of tootling their Stearman trainers down the runway, and the Warhawk is kind of moving on its own. And there are other stories about, you know, the kind of training they did with these airplanes, being told as a matter of course, for example, to like at a certain point fly it when you're up there at about 8,500 feet, just fly it, just point the nose straight up and just fly it straight up until it starts to fall, you know, in order to practice recovering, you know. So incredibly gutsy flying, that's just a routine for the people who flew these things. The P-51 was a whole other grade up from the Warhawk. Okay, so these men, and you can see some of the heroic photographs on the upper left, got to fly the best thing there was. And the distinctive red tails, red noses indicated this all-black fighter group. And Frisell's photographs really capture very beautifully the esprit de corps, but also the kind of momentous beauty and power of the airplanes that these men flew. Which brings me to this, and this is where we start to turn a little bit towards Port Chicago. You're looking at not, well, it is a photograph, but you're looking at a photograph of a sculpture. It's basically a body cast made of a Black artist of his own body, an artist named Michael Richards. And you can see the airplanes that are piercing his body, flying into his body, are basically, I think you can say they're P-51 Mustangs. And this is the way Richard's life-size sculpture made in 1999 looks. You know, for those of you who may have seen paintings of Saint Sebastian, who is pierced with arrows as a martyr, Michael Richards' conceit as he dresses himself as a Tuskegee Airman. Notice the aviator's costume of the 1940s down to the boots and the headgear, the leather flight jacket, etc. It's not arrows, but P-51s that pierce him. And although this is sort of open to interpretation, you know, the way I read it is that it's, you know, being successively wounded now in the late 20th century by the piercing power of what one once had and what one once was promised, because the democratic ideal of the Tuskegee Airmen certainly did not bode an instant turn to greater democracy for Black citizens in the United States. You know, is a dream alive that doesn't come true, or is it something worse? In Bruce Springsteen's words from his song "The River," similarly about the pain of a dream that didn't come true. Here is Richards with his self-portrait there, and this is, alas, where Port Chicago, or something like Port Chicago, comes into play, because Michael Richards had an art fellowship at the World Trade Center in September of 2001. And he had an artist studio there on one of the top floors of one of the towers. And being an artist, he had actually spent the whole night, as I recall, of September 10th, 11th, there in his studio at work on a piece, not this one, which was already made, but another one with a aviating theme, because Richards is quite obsessed with the Tuskegee Airmen. In any case, Michael Richards died on September 11th, 2001. And the irony of his being killed by an airplane flying into him is not lost on anyone who sees this sculpture he had made 2 years before. At Port Chicago now, or Port Chicago soon after, you know, we've seen this photograph, the wreckage, the remembrance, the business, I suppose it's an all-American business of forgetting, but also remembering too. You know, what form does it take? For those who survived by simply not being there by chance that night, like Fred Meeks, you know, on the left, and now much more recently, who knows exactly what form those memories take. Another sailor who survived that night, Ray Ross. You know, this photographer, I believe the Los Angeles Times, makes it so that, you know, the two versions of the man, the older and the younger, are superimposed into photographs. It's a lovely conceit. For others of us, we can go there now to the site and, you know, see how 50 years to the day and during the first term of Bill Clinton's presidency, a memorial was established. But I also want you to see, and if you get a chance to go there, I encourage you to go. But I think, you know, something to think about is actually not this sign in the front, or not even that placard there on the left, but what you can see, those sort of, like, I don't know, dots or something in the upper left, just behind the placard. And what those are stumps, you know, pile drived into the ground to suggest to be the pier that blew up that night. It's a very haunted, empty spot, as you might imagine, made stronger by the fact that there is no big, in my opinion, no big, shiny memorial. And the military sense of marching and being loyal to one another, I suppose, you know, fidelity in these anthropomorphic shapes, leading out to nowhere, but still in formation, is, I think, very powerful. You can imagine there's just gentle rustling of the water, the tides, the grass. And to get closer to these stumps and kind of sense their texture is to feel all the more the presence of the past. And in our country, you know, part of that presence of the past is the story of Black victims of racial injustice. And it's been my privilege today to share with you my reflections on this very important event of the Second World War in the United States. Thank you.
Yeah, I need to bring you back visually. I think you may have shut down. There we are. Okay. Did you know about the explosion before you visited the port, or is this something that you stumbled upon? Was one of the questions.
I had heard about it for a long time and had always wanted to go there, so I did not stumble upon it. I knew about it. And then perhaps once I moved to California in 2012, I thought it would be a great place to go, but it seems somehow really remote and difficult and inaccessible. You have to make an appointment and it has to be a certain time of day, etc. But eventually, yeah, with two Navy people, we did go up there, and it's pretty amazing. As you can imagine, it's not like there's not 100 people you're there with a couple people. You know, it's not well traveled, and that makes it kind of more powerful.
Okay. Do you use much military visuals in your classes?
Yes, in fact, I'm going to be teaching a class in the fall here at Stanford on the visual culture of World War II in America. And I've written some books. One's called Wartime Kiss. Another is called Icons of Grief. And yet another one's called Summoning Pearl Harbor, which are all about America in the war. And I was born in 1963, but I think the story I always tell myself is my interest in it comes from the fact that my father flew in the Royal Air Force as an American during the war and met my mother in England. She was English during the war, and I think it was always present for us in our house.
Okay. What do your students think when you use those type of military visuals?
Well, the class I just described is going to be for older students. There's something at Stanford called continuing studies, so more for adults, but I do talk about World War II. I teach a class for undergraduates and PhD students with a colleague called, I think it's called World War II History, Place, and Loss. And they're very, you know, they're into it. They get it. But I also think, you know, it's hard for them. It's hard if you're 18 years old to really experience this quite intensely. I don't know. So it's an interesting moment where people my age and people so much younger come together, and you know, I think they have in many cases a serious but maybe only abstract notion of it. But I did have a student write a beautiful paper for me in that class about his grandfather's cough, which he, the grandfather, contracted in the South Pacific. And it basically was some kind of residue of a jungle fever, which lasted his whole life, and which is a distinct memory of my student growing up in this century. And it's an example of how, of something I described at the end of this talk, the way the past carries forward in the present and kind of makes a vivid impact even on those who were not alive when the events unfolded.
Catherine was submitted a question here. She said, once your presentation was moving, and then asked, where are we now related to film and history and the story of those persecuted, like the Japanese Americans and African Americans? I think looking more at film and in photos.
Well, perhaps there could be a great movie made about the internment of the Japanese, and a great movie made about Black servicemen in the war, Tuskegee Airmen. You know, people have different definitions of great. I mean, I don't know. It's hard to make, in my opinion, it's hard to make a great film about such painful episodes and examples of systemic racism, but it is achievable, and it would be a grand achievement if someone were to do it. Apologies if I'm forgetting some film that already has done this, but
did you see
yes.
the film on World War I that was nominated last year for an Oscar?
Oh yes, I did see that, 1917.
What did you think of their visuals?
I actually thought it was a pretty bad movie, in my opinion. I understand about the one shot, the sort of marvel of being able to show the one shot, but it seemed very glitzy and special effecty for me, and I couldn't really believe the emotion of it. It seemed almost like a horror movie in terms of running through some of the different sort of standard themes of the horror movie, the collapsing building, the bodies floating, things like that. I much preferred, I think it's a film called They Will Not Grow Old, or They Shall Not Grow Old, which was a documentary made by the director of the Tolkien, the movies, The Hobbit and so on. I forget his name right now, but where the film was colorized, the speed of the film was adjusted. So all these things that one, I guess, quote unquote, should not do. But yet I found it moving, a very moving depiction of World War I. Yeah.
It came out last year also, I think, or maybe the year before.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. That's all for questions. What else would you like to add as we sort of close?
I don't think anything in particular, Mike. I mean, again, I'm just appreciate the opportunity to share this material with everyone, and I thank you and I thank the audience for joining.